Conservation is generally associated with places far away from people, and places where nature is largely left to its own devices, without a heavy influence from humans. But cities host a great deal of biodiversity, and they matter in conversations about conservation. In this video, we will outline some of the misconceptions about cities that often cause them to be overlooked in conservation. These are the sorts of images that come up when you Google the words city and urban. Images that are dominated by buildings, concrete, and glass. They're dominated by human constructions, and there doesn't seem to be a lot, if any, non-human species present. On the other hand, these are the sorts of images that came up when I searched for conservation and biodiversity. The images are dominated by plants and animals, and people are nowhere to be seen. The disconnect between cities and conservation is not uncommon. Urban areas only account for about 3% of the Earth's surface, so it's easy to want to write them off as a lost cause for conservation. Although we have discussed why it's a problematic view, conservation is often viewed as a tool to keep nature protected from the damages that humans cause. And because urban areas are synonymous with humans and human modification of the landscape, they are generally not thought of as places for conservation. In fact, many conservationists believe that the battle has already been lost in cities, and that conservation efforts would be better spent elsewhere. Whenever someone does make a call to action for more biodiversity conservation efforts in cities, they are usually met with surprise, doubt, or skepticism, as there is a pervasive narrative in policy, practice, and in the public psyche that urban environments are of little conservation value. This is a common position in conservation that stems from a number of misconceptions about why conservation is not compatible with urban areas. First, conservation strategies tend to favor large, high-quality, well-connected patches of natural ecosystems with a low prevalence of threats. But because these types of systems are rare in and around cities, urban environments are seen as inherently not as good for conservation. Habitat patches in urban areas also tend to be small and highly vulnerable, so they are sometimes seen as expendable to conservation. Finally, cities are also rarely thought of as biodiverse landscapes. The general prevailing wisdom is that the few native species that remain in urban areas are widespread generalists that are in little need of conservation support, and that most of the other species found in cities are non-natives with no conservation value. Because of this, it's not uncommon for large-scale conservation planning exercises to assign urban areas a low conservation value or to exclude them altogether. Let's look at each of these misconceptions in more detail. We have talked quite a bit in this course about how increasing the size, quality, and connectivity of habitat patches and natural ecosystems will improve the conditions for many different species. But it is important to note that this doesn't mean that the smaller, more degraded, or fragmented habitats are worthless. There is no substitute for protecting extensive tracts of natural ecosystems, but these areas are few and far between. You can see this on the map here, which shows the remaining areas of so-called wilderness on the planet, the largest pieces of land not currently under direct human influence. You'll notice on this map that the remaining so-called wilderness areas on land are concentrated in 5 key areas: the Arctic, the boreal forests of Canada, Russia, and Alaska, the Amazon, the Sahara Desert, and the central desert regions of Australia. While protecting these areas is important, look at all of the parts of the map that are not identified as wilderness: most of Europe, Southeast Asia, and most of North America outside of the Arctic and boreal forests. Think about all of the species that live in these places. For conservation to be able to support the full spectrum of biodiversity on the planet, it has to include lands across the entire spectrum of land uses, from wildlands to the spaces where people live and work. Remember back to earlier in the semester when we talked about conservation priority setting. Conservation scientists believe that at least 40%, but as much as 75% of the planet needs to be protected, with many subscribing to the idea of half Earth, where at least 50% of the planet needs to be protected. The fact that less than half of the Earth's surface remains as intact natural ecosystems, coupled with its unequal distribution, means that it is impossible to meet biodiversity conservation goals in just areas that are far away from people. It is critical for conservation to operate in areas that are less than perfect, and in human-modified systems, including cities. Of course, given the nature of urban areas, any habitat patches that are available in and around cities are going to be smaller than those in more rural or wilderness settings. But this doesn't mean that they are of no value to conservation. We've talked about the species-area relationship and island biogeography rules in this class before, where the bigger the habitat patch, the more species it is likely to support. But like all rules, there are exceptions, and these rules don't predict the success of all species. The life history of many species, their reproductive requirements, generation time, and mobility can play a huge role in determining the likelihood of a species being able to persist in an urban environment. For example, large patches of habitat are not needed to support the persistence of small plants with limited dispersal ability, like those with heavy seeds. And many other species are highly adaptable and have learned to exploit urban environments, which we'll hear more about in the next video. There is also the role of the matrix. We haven't talked a lot about the matrix in this class, but the matrix is the dominant land use or land cover type in a particular area. When we think about priority lands for conservation, the matrix is usually some kind of natural ecosystem. But in cities, the matrix will be the built environment. The urban matrix is often treated as non-habitat by conservation planners, as being too hostile to support much non-human life, or to allow wildlife to easily pass through it to move between habitat patches. But recent research has been turning this assumption on its head, and has shown that in fact the urban matrix can be very important to many species, providing resources and supporting or even facilitating movement across the landscape. So it can't really be written off as non-habitat for all species. Even though the matrix of the built environment doesn't seem like it would provide a lot of resources, it does. Think about your own neighborhood. While it is likely dominated by buildings, roads, and sidewalks, there are probably a number of smaller, little hidden pockets of habitat support around. For example, a single street tree can provide shelter and a food source for birds and a number of small mammals. And backyard gardens in residential areas can also provide a few resources and act as a safe refuge for wildlife. Despite the growing body of research supporting the idea that urban areas are not a lost cause to conservation, they are still a largely overlooked ecosystem. A 2002 paper by James Miller and Richard Hobbs found that just 6% of the papers published in conservation biology described work conducted in urban areas. In the 20 years since that paper was published, things have gotten a bit better, and there are new journals like Landscape and Urban Planning that have helped to bridge the gap between conservation and urban planning. However, urban areas are still understudied and underrepresented, and there's still a bit of a stigma of working in urban areas amongst conservation scientists, as it's sometimes seen as not real conservation work. The idea that humans and nature are separate from each other, and that conservation is meant to protect nature from humans, is something that we have talked about a lot in this course. Although it is a flawed perspective, it has dominated Western thought for centuries, and it has led to the compartmentalization of landscapes into places for people and places for nature. The result of this has been that cities are not considered to be of value for conservation because conservation is concerned with nature, and cities are not where nature is. But this cannot be further from the truth, as cities are indeed full of non-human life and can actually be highly biodiverse landscapes. We will dive more into the biodiversity of cities in the next video.